If that night I had walked out of that cabin with you, the child in my belly would not be carrying the name Hale. Now, if you heard a woman say that, right there in front of her husband and the man who once almost ran away with her, would you believe the four of them could keep sitting together peacefully until morning? In Willow Ford, people still like to think of Ellen Hale as the gentle sort of wife who only knew how to mind the kitchen, pour coffee for her husband, and show up at church every Sunday. They had no idea that 15 years earlier, on a snowy mountain night, Ellen had stood between two roads. On one side was Thomas, safe and proper. On the other side was Jonah, reckless and full of promise. And tonight, with a blizzard sealing off every way back down the mountain, the four of them locked in that little wooden cabin, Ellen decided to finally say the words she should have said 15 years ago. But this story doesn't start in the cabin. It starts down in the valley, where the dusty main road of Willow Ford runs past the Hale family diner, then slowly climbs toward the mountain. Willow Ford is the kind of small town where people can tell which family is riding by just from the sound of the horses' hooves. In summer, the wind carries the smell of dust and dry grass. In winter, it carries the scent of snow and old stories people thought they had buried. That year marked the 15th winter since the night the cabin on the mountain burned down. To outsiders, it was nothing but an ugly incident in the past. To Thomas and Ellen, it was the shadow that sat right behind them every time they ate dinner in silence. Thomas Hale was the kind of man the West kept turning out. Broad shoulders, back bent from work, hands always marked with either mud or grease from the stables and the wagon. He was not a man of many words. Folks believed he was the hero of that night long ago. The man who did everything he could. The man who stayed inside the flames until there was nothing more to be done. No one asked for details. The story sounded neat enough that way. Thomas never corrected it. He just went on living, married Ellen, tried to rebuild the farm, tried to fill the empty space his younger brother had left behind. Ellen, for her part, learned how to live with silence. She woke early, brewed coffee, cooked breakfast, mended shirts, kept an eye on a few chickens behind the diner. People liked coming to Ellen's place for the good apple pie, and because she didn't ask too many questions. It was the kind of politeness that only comes from those who have been through enough to know it is better not to touch other people's wounds, just as you do not let anyone touch your own. Only sometimes, when she stood on the back porch in the late afternoon, Ellen's eyes would drift toward the mountain range, where a tiny dot marked the old Hale cabin. Then she would turn away, as if she had only looked up by accident. Jonah Pike had left Willow Ford right after the fire. People told all sorts of versions about that day. Some said he packed his things in a single night and vanished. Others swore he got on his horse and never once looked back. Nobody knew for sure. They only knew that after he left, whenever someone mentioned Jonah's name, the whole diner fell quiet for an extra heartbeat. Little by little, that name turned into something like a stone buried under the grass. Everyone knew it was there, but no one wanted to dig it up. Until that winter. A strange wagon rolled into town, and on the front seat sat a broad-shouldered man whose hair was starting to show threads of gray. Beside him was a younger woman, a dark shawl wrapped tight around her neck. The man turned his head to look up at the wooden sign that said Willow Ford, and a few people standing outside the diner nearly dropped their coffee cups. Jonah Pike had come back. Clara, Jonah's new wife, had never even heard of this town before she married him. All she knew was that her husband spoke very little about his past, especially about some night that involved a fire. Every now and then, she would feel him jerk awake in his sleep, hear him call a name. At first, she thought it must be a brother's name or some old friend. Only recently, on a cold night, had he whispered the name Ellen into the dark, his breath coming fast. Clara did not ask him about it then, but the question stayed quietly inside her, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. On the day Jonah brought Clara to Willow Ford, the wind had started to change, bringing with it the first hints of snow. People in town watched the couple with all kinds of looks, curiosity, annoyance, even a kind of relief that at last they had something new to talk about. Thomas heard that Jonah was back in town through a single, simple sentence. Pikes returned. The man who brought the news did not have to say more. Thomas set down the glass he was washing, wiped his hands on his apron, and stood still for so long that Ellen had to call his name twice. His shoulders trembled just a little, but when he turned around, his voice was still low and steady as always. He only asked, "Where are they?" That afternoon, the clouds dropped low, and the wind shifted, blowing down from the mountain. The old folks in town said that kind of wind never brought anything good. By nightfall, the snow was falling thicker than usual. The last mail carrier riding down from the mountain said the road was already slick, and no one should travel far. But there are meetings people have been running from for 15 years. At some point, no matter how icy the road gets or how hard the snow falls, they can no longer be avoided. When night truly settled in, 4 names, Thomas, Ellen, Jonah, Clara, each in their own way, all turned toward the same place, the wooden cabin on the mountain that everyone had tried to forget. They did not yet know that before morning came, it would not just be snow piling up at the door. All the things they had never dared to say would fill that room to the brim. News of Jonah's return did not come to Ellen in a loud voice. It came in glances. That afternoon, while Ellen was wiping down the counter, the diner door swung open and a rush of cold wind came in, carrying the smell of fresh snow. A young woman Ellen had never seen before stepped in first, pulling her shawl tighter around her neck, brown eyes moving around the room with polite curiosity, but no sense of belonging. Behind her was Jonah. He paused for an extra heartbeat right there in the doorway, as if that threshold was the last line between 15 years ago and now. Ellen didn't drop anything. She only set the coffee pot down a little more slowly. Part of it was surprise. Part of it was that her hand suddenly didn't feel as steady as it always had. 15 years is enough time for a man to change. His hair had silver strands in it now. The lines on his forehead were deeper, his coat heavier, but the way he stood was the same. The way Jonah tilted his head just a bit, let his eyes sweep quickly across the room, then stop on one person only. They looked at each other for the briefest moment. No greeting, no smile. Then Ellen turned to the young woman. "What can I get you this evening?" Ellen asked, her voice still even. "Some hot soup, please," the woman said, her voice shaking a little from the cold. "Tea and a cup of coffee for my husband." From the doorway, Jonah slowly pulled off his gloves. He didn't look around anymore. He kept his gaze on his hands, as if they had just touched something they were not supposed to touch. Thomas was not there at that hour. He was still out by the stables, worried after hearing the storm warnings. Up on the mountain, the clouds had dropped so low it looked like you could reach up and touch them. By the time Thomas stepped into the diner, the 3 of them were almost done eating. Clara, keeping all the proper manners, smiled, offered a greeting, said her name. Jonah rose as well and gave a small nod. Thomas stood in the doorway, brushed the snow off his shoulders, then looked straight at his old friend. For a moment, the diner went completely quiet. Even the clinking of spoons against bowls stopped. "Jonah," Thomas said, the name coming out like an old stone picked up after years of being left alone. Thomas, Jonah answered, dipping his head slightly. No one mentioned the cabin. No one mentioned the fire. They traded a few words about the road, about cattle, about the storm that was coming. Clara watched them, looking from one face to the other, feeling clearly that something heavier than the cold air was pressing in between these men. Ellen brought another pot of coffee to the table, her hand steady again, but her heart was pounding so hard she had to force herself to take slow breaths. She heard Jonah ask about the ranch, about Thomas's younger brother. Then she heard Thomas answer only, "Matthew is gone. You know that." That sentence cut the conversation clean, like a knife. Night fell faster than usual. The mail carrier coming down from the mountain stopped in front of the diner, slapped the snow off his hat, and called out loud enough for everyone to hear, "Storm tonight. Anyone with business up there better finish it early. Road to the Hale cabins likely to be blocked soon." That line dropped into the room like a rock thrown into water, and the ripples it sent out were felt most clearly by 4 people. Thomas lifted his head. The mountain cabin was where he usually stayed when he had to spend the night up there with the herd at the end of the season. For days he had been hesitating, not going up because the wind had been shifting in strange ways. But if the storm turned out to be bad, ropes, makeshift pens, feed supplies, all of it could be torn apart. The last time he didn't get up there in time, he lost a whole batch of calves. That kind of loss he could live with. The one before that, he could not. I have to get up to the cabin before it gets completely dark," Thomas said quietly to Ellen once the customers had left. "If the ropes snap, we'll have nothing left by morning." "The road is slick already," Ellen answered. "It's dangerous for you to go alone." Thomas looked at her for a moment. In the warm yellow lamplight, Ellen's face showed the tiny lines at the corners of her eyes clearly. 15 years under the same roof had taught them how to live side by side, how to divide chores and share worries. But that night on the mountain, they had never managed to share it in words. "Let me go with him," another voice broke in. Jonah was standing near the counter, hat in his hand. "I remember the way up there, and I need to take a look at a few things." Ellen felt the air in the room change. Clara stepped closer to her husband, resting her hand lightly on his sleeve. "If the road is really that bad, maybe wait until tomorrow," she said, worry in every word. "Tomorrow might be too late," Thomas replied. "We just go up, check everything, tighten a few spots, and come right back down. We'll be fine." He paused a moment, then turned to Ellen. "You stay here at the diner, close up early." Ellen nodded, but there was no calm in her chest. She knew Thomas was not a reckless man. She also knew Jonah had not come back just to eat a bowl of soup and leave. And she knew the cabin on the mountain held more than ropes and livestock waiting for them. The storm came faster than anyone had guessed. By the time Jonah and Thomas were urging the wagon halfway up the mountain, the wind was already throwing sheets of snow across their faces. The road that had always seemed familiar suddenly felt strange inside that thick white blur. Down in the valley, Clara stood on the diner's front porch, clutching her shawl tight, watching the tiny shape of the wagon until it disappeared completely. Ellen stood beside her, apron still in her hands, eyes fixed on the same direction. "Do you think they'll be all right?" Clara asked softly. "Men around here are used to the mountains and the snow," Ellen said. "But a storm like this is not something you should underestimate." She went quiet for a moment, then added more to herself than to Clara, "We shouldn't have let them go up there together." A strong gust of wind hit them, pushing both women back under the porch roof. Snow was already whitening the road. The mail carrier passed by again, shouting toward the diner. "If you two plan on going up that mountain, you'd better go now. In a little while, you won't be able to make it." Clara turned to Ellen. Doubt and fear mingled in her eyes. "If the road gets blocked, will they spend the night up there?" she asked. "Alone. Or—" "There's a cabin up there," Ellen answered. "The old Hale place. They'll take shelter there. In the morning, if the weather lets up, they'll come down." Her voice was calm, but her chest tightened as she heard herself say the word cabin. In her mind, she could see scorched wooden walls, smell the smoke, hear the wind screaming through cracked window frames, clearer than the snow now falling in front of them. In the end, it was the storm that made the decision for them. When Clara could no longer bear the thought of the two men facing the mountain, the night and whatever past lay between them all by themselves, she turned to Ellen and said a sentence that both women would remember for the rest of their lives. "If you know the way, would you come with me?" she asked. "I don't want my husband spending the night in a place I've never even seen." Ellen looked at Clara's young face, at those eyes that had no idea what part of the story they had just stepped into. She could have said no. She could have locked the door, turned out the lights, and sat waiting for morning, just like she had done 15 years ago. But outside, the wind was howling, and it carried with it something else. The voice of a woman who had stayed silent for far too long. "Bundle up," Ellen said, her voice dropping low. "If we make it up there in time, the four of us will spend the night together in that cabin. At least, no one will be up there alone." By the time the second wagon rolled out of Willow Ford, the snow was already filling in the tracks the first one had left behind. Up on the mountain, the Hale family's wooden cabin was waiting, quiet in the whiteout. Like a closed mouth holding tight to a story it could not keep locked away for another 15 years. Mountain roads in a blizzard are not meant for people who don't know them. The wagon wheels ground down over a thin layer of ice, every turn of the road forcing Clara to see how tightly Ellen held the reins. Clara pulled her shawl closer, sitting beside Ellen on the wagon seat, feeling as if the wind were trying to cut straight through to her bones. The lantern hanging in front swung back and forth, throwing a weak yellow light across Ellen's face. In that flickering glow, Clara saw that Ellen was not just a gentle diner owner. She was someone who knew this road too well, who knew storms and mountains and that waiting cabin above them. Every time the wagon lurched over a rut, Clara grabbed the edge of the seat and, without even thinking, asked the question she had been repeating ever since they left town. "Are we almost there, Ellen?" Ellen did not answer right away. She looked ahead to where the light of the cabin finally appeared, a tiny flame in an endless sea of white. "Almost," she said quietly. "Once we get there, we won't have to worry about the wind anymore. Only about what waits inside those four walls." Clara did not fully understand what she meant. All she heard in her mind was the word safe when she saw the outline of the wooden roof. The cabin door flew open just as they pulled the wagon to a stop. Thomas appeared first, shoulders dusted with snow, hair wet, face tight and cold. Behind him, Jonah stood back in the shadows, a bucket of fresh water still in his hand. For a heartbeat, Thomas's gaze moved from Ellen to Clara, then back to the cabin, as if weighing whether two more people would make the cramped room feel too small. But all he said was, "Come inside. The road is closing up already. We might not get down tomorrow." Ellen stepped in first, feeling a strange tightness in her chest as her foot crossed the threshold. The walls were the same old wood, Some boards replaced here and there, but the scorched marks near the ceiling were still there, like black fingers reaching up, hunting for a way out. The fireplace was blazing, its heat slapping against her face. But the cold that rose from her memories stayed exactly the same. Clara looked around the cabin with the eyes of someone who had never been there before. A narrow bed up against the wall, a few wooden chairs, a small table, some pegs for coats, a corner given over to tools and supplies, ropes, buckets, a saw. Everything was simple, practical. She smiled her thanks to Thomas, then turned to Jonah, trying to catch his gaze. "I told you, I wasn't going to let you stay up on this mountain alone," she said softly. Jonah gave a small nod and tried to smile, but it did not quite reach his eyes. "The road was bad," was all he said. Then he turned to Ellen. "I did not think you would come up here again." Ellen met his eyes, and for a second, it was just the two of them and the sound of the wind at their backs. "Neither did I," she replied. "But storms do not ask what we want." Thomas settled Clara in a chair close to the fire and handed her a cup of hot water. Ellen hung up their wet coats, her hands moving with an old, easy rhythm, as if her body still remembered exactly where cups belonged, where the basin should sit. For a while, all four of them were silent. Only the crackle of the fire and the roar of the wind against the walls filled the room. Smoke mingled with the damp smell of old wood and the faint scent of wet wool. Clara was the one who finally broke the silence. "This cabin, has it been empty for a long time?" she asked. Thomas glanced up at the ceiling before answering. "Not exactly. I still come up here to watch the herd at the end of the season, but I don't stay overnight much." That "don't stay overnight much" hung in the air, a tiny confession about the one night everyone remembered and no one named. Jonah stood near the window, staring out into the white. Outside, the snow was so thick it erased the horizon. He laid his hand on the wooden frame where the old scorch marks still lingered. His hand fit there exactly as it had 15 years earlier, except back then his fingers had been wet, and the smoke had been so thick he could hardly breathe. Ellen saw the way his palm settled on that burned wood, and her heart lurched. She turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with folding and straightening the extra blankets. Clara caught that quick look between them, something that was not the look of two people who had just met that afternoon. She did not have a name for it yet. She only knew the hairs at the back of her neck stirred, and it was not because of any draft. Night came down fully, and the wind beat against the cabin as if it meant to tear it off the mountain. Thomas checked the door latch, the fire, the coils of rope, and the equipment in the corner. "We are all staying here tonight," he said. "The road down is as good as closed." Clara nodded, trying to look calm. "So, the four of us," she said, looking around the cabin, "will wait for morning together." The words sounded simple enough, but to Ellen, each one was like a soft knock on the door she had spent 15 years keeping shut. 4 people. 1 roof. 1 night. Like before. And not at all like before. They divided the blankets and laid out places to sleep. Clara was given the spot closest to the fire. Ellen lay on the other side of the table. Thomas took the space near the door. Jonah chose a corner by the window. Each person kept a little island of space, yet in that small room, every breath, every shift of weight, sounded as if it were right beside someone else's ear. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Clara's voice slipped into the quiet, soft, but carrying a curiosity that had been held back for years. "Jonah," she asked, looking at her husband through the firelight. "When was the first time you came to this cabin?" Jonah stiffened a little, as if someone had shaken him awake from an old dream. He looked at Thomas first, then at Ellen, before he answered. "A long time ago," he said. "Long before you knew me. A very long time before." Clara smiled, trying to lighten the air. "I figured as much. Every time you startle in your sleep, you call out for this place. And for somebody else." She looked straight at him. "Tonight you don't need to dream anymore. You are exactly where you always are in your sleep." Thomas turned his face away and stared into the fire. Ellen's fingers clenched hard around the edge of her blanket. Clara's words were so simple they were almost frightening. 2 men, 2 women, a cabin on the mountain, a name called in the dark. Everything Clara did not know had stacked itself neatly inside that innocent little sentence. The wind howled, and somewhere above them, a sharp crack sounded along the roof. Jonah swallowed. He could have laughed it off, changed the subject, shoved everything back under the same old silence. He had been doing exactly that for 15 years. But tonight, with Ellen only a few steps away, with Thomas sitting right there, with his young wife watching him with eyes that only wanted to understand the man she had married, Jonah realized that silence was no longer the safe choice. It was only another form of cowardice. "There are things," Jonah began, his voice dropping low, "that I tried to bury here, in this very cabin. I thought if I went far enough, if the snow piled up deep enough, they would disappear." He paused and looked at each of them in turn. "But it seems winter cannot bury everything." Thomas leaned forward. Ellen lifted her head. Clara held her breath. A log snapped in the fire, sparks jumping, as if to remind them that flame was still there, only waiting for someone to feed it one more ember. The night outside was very long, and the Hale cabin was no longer big enough to hold 4 people and everything they carried with them. Not if those things were to stay unspoken for another 15 years. Outside, the wind screamed as if someone were trying to rip every plank off the cabin, testing how much longer it could hold. Inside, the fire in the stove threw its glow over 4 faces, each carrying a different kind of trouble. The silence was so thick, you could hear your own heartbeat. Jonah was the one who broke it. "If we make it down the mountain tomorrow," he said slowly, "this will follow us back to the valley. Everyone will tell it their own way. But tonight, at least once, let me tell it the way it really happened." Thomas rested his elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames without blinking. Clara sat up straighter, hands clasped tightly in her lap like a student listening to a lesson. Ellen pulled the blanket closer, but it was not because of the cold. 15 years ago, Jonah began, I did not come up to this cabin because of Matthew, and not because of Lydia. I came because of a small piece of paper left under my coffee cup. He turned to Ellen. There was no accusation in his look, only the weariness of someone who had carried one story for too long. The note said, "Tonight, the cabin on the mountain. If you still want to leave Willow Ford." Clara blinked. "Who wrote it?" she whispered, though her heart already knew. "Ellen," Jonah answered plainly. Back then she was not a Hale yet. The whole town believed she would marry Thomas, and I was too young, too foolish, thinking love could pull the 2 of us out of this valley. In Jonah's memory, the snow that night was not as heavy as tonight, but the cold cut just as deep. He remembered lighting the stove ahead of time, remembered the wind sneaking in through the cracks, remembered how every minute stretched out because he was afraid Ellen would change her mind. When the door finally opened, he thought the decision had been made. Ellen came in with her cloak damp from mist, hair blown wild by the wind, face pale. "You should not be here," she said, in the same low voice she was using tonight. "If Thomas finds out—" "I am already here," Jonah remembered answering. "If you want to go, we leave tonight. If you want to stay, I will stay. Just tell me the truth once. That is all I ask." They argued. Not loudly, but hard enough that the sound of the wind disappeared. Ellen spoke of duty, of family, of a quiet life that made sense. Jonah spoke of the railroad in the east, of towns where no one knew their past, of mornings without judging eyes. There was a moment when Ellen stepped closer than a woman about to marry another man should come. Jonah could still feel how her hand shook inside his. Then the oil lamp spilled, Jonah said, looking up at the blackened patch near the ceiling. It was not the mountain. It was not the wind. It was us. The first flame was small, just a streak of light on the curtain. They both tried to stamp it out. But the cloth was dry, the wood was old, a bit of oil had spilled on the floor. All of it came together into what the town now simply called the cabin fire. They had not even grasped what was happening when coughing erupted in the back room. Matthew and Lydia had gotten there first, brought supplies up for the cattle and decided to stay because of the wind. Neither Jonah nor Ellen had known they were inside. "I ran in. Thomas ran in too," Jonah said, his voice rough. "I got Lydia as far as the door. Matthew turned back for something, maybe that little box he always carried. I wanted to go back in. By then the fire was already eating the roof. Someone grabbed me from behind and held on." He turned to Thomas. "That was you." The stove popped loud as a gunshot, making Clara jump. Thomas did not deny it. He only swallowed hard, his hand tightening on his knee. "I thought you were about to run." Thomas spoke for the first time since the story began. "When I got there, Lydia was outside, Matthew was still in, and you were standing right in the doorway. I saw the roof about to cave in. If you went back in, we would have lost 3 people. I chose to hold you back. I did not have the courage to let go." Jonah let out a dry, humorless laugh. "In your eyes, I was the coward who ran from the flames. In my eyes, you were the man who tore me away from my last chance to make anything right. We stood in the same spot, looking at the same fire, and for 15 years, neither of us ever said what we had seen." Clara covered her mouth. "Then the rumors," she asked. "Why does everyone in town say you ran away?" "Because I left," Jonah said. "Not that night, but after. When the smoke cleared and the looks all started to feel the same. When people whispered that if I had not been here in this cabin with Ellen that night, maybe there would not have been a fire at all." Clara's gaze shook, then settled on Ellen. "You were there," she said softly. "You and my husband, and the man you were supposed to marry." Ellen drew in a long breath. She had been silent for so many years that the words inside her felt like stones that had to be lifted one by one. "That night," Ellen began, "I walked into this cabin planning to leave Willow Ford. I had a small bag ready, a little money, a few things. I thought I could go with Jonah, get on a train, disappear. I also thought the child I was carrying would take the name Pike, and no one in this valley would be close enough to count months and suspect anything." Thomas's head snapped up. "Ellen," he whispered, as if someone had struck him. Ellen did not look at her husband. She looked at the space between the two men, as if she were looking at a road buried under snow. But when the fire broke out, when Matthew and Lydia were trapped inside, when Thomas arrived, something became very clear to me. She went on. East or west, Hale or any other name, none of it would matter if I spent the rest of my life knowing I had started that fire and walked away. She turned fully to Jonah. I told you to go. Not with me, just go away from here. I told you to keep quiet. If you said I had been here, that I wrote the note, that I had tried to run, this town would crush us both. I chose to let you carry the blame alone. Then she turned to Thomas. For the first time that night, her eyes met his and did not look away. You asked why I married you so quickly afterward, Ellen said, her voice steady but trembling underneath. Because I thought I was pregnant. I did not know for sure whose child it was, and I told myself that if I had already let Jonah go, then I would let the child stay, take the Hale name, grow up never knowing about this cabin, this fire, that night. She stopped. There was nowhere left to back up to. The sentence she had forced down for 15 years finally rose to the surface. If that night I had walked out of this cabin with you, Ellen said, turning toward Jonah, the child in my belly would not have carried the name Hale. For a few seconds in that small cabin, no one breathed. The words hit the wooden floor like a heavy log, shaking the room all the way down to its beams. Jonah looked as if someone had slapped him. Thomas sat frozen, eyes wide and unfocused. Clara looked from one to the other, knowing she had just been handed the key to a door she was not sure she wanted opened. Ellen lowered her head and added so quietly it was almost for herself alone. In the end, it was almost a mercy. The baby did not have to carry anybody's name. It never lived long enough to hear the stories grown folks invent, just so they can keep on living. Outside, the wind still screamed. But inside the cabin, the loudest thing of all was the silence that spread after the confession of a woman who had stayed quiet for far too long. After Ellen finished, the cabin went so quiet they could almost hear the snow on the roof. The fire still burned, but everyone felt cold. Thomas stared at the old burn marks a long time before he finally spoke. So I have been living all these years with half a story, he said softly. Half of what happened to my brother. Half of who my wife is. Half of who my friend was, while I let the town call him a coward. Ellen gripped her blanket. If it is too much, you can leave, she told him. If you want to go down there and tell all of Willow Ford, I will not stop you. I let you carry only half the truth for too long. Thomas turned to Jonah. Why did you let everybody believe you ran? Jonah looked worn out, but lighter. Because that day I thought I was the only one who could stand the town's stare, he said. You had lost your brother. Ellen might have been pregnant. I told myself the man who lit the match should be the one to carry it. I thought silence was sacrifice. Turns out it was pride too. Clara moved closer and laid a hand on his arm. You are not a coward, she said quietly. You just chose the wrong way to protect people. And I let myself live with questions I was too afraid to ask. That is on me. She looked over at Ellen. I do not know how long it will take before I can look at him without seeing you standing between us, she admitted. But if you lived up here 15 years carrying all that, then I can learn to live with the truth now that it is out. Ellen only nodded. She did not ask for forgiveness. The relief came from finally not having to guard that door alone. Outside, the wind's voice changed. It no longer clawed at the boards. It just moved across the roof in long, tired strokes. Nobody slept well that night, but nobody walked out either. For the first time since the fire, they stayed under the same roof without pretending to forget it. By morning, the sky was pale and the road began to show through the snow. Before leaving, they straightened the little house, wedged fresh wood into soft places, cleared the drift from the porch. Small chores, but every hand that touched the walls and door felt the cabin differently now. At the well, Thomas stepped in to take part of the weight from Jonah's bucket. "Back then, I needed someone to blame," he said. "You were standing in the right place. I believed the easiest story. Today we can divide it back where it belongs." "And I," Jonah answered, "let you live as the hero in a story where nobody really won. We all lost. At least now each of us knows what it is we lost." At the doorway, Clara glanced at the black streaks along the eaves, then at Ellen. "If the town needs someone to talk about, blame me," she said. "And say Jonah's new wife is jealous and unreasonable. Folks around here will believe that easy enough." Ellen gave a rough, warm laugh. "Let them say what they want. As long as the four of us who were here remember what really happened, that is enough." Before they left, they all turned back to the cabin. The burn marks were still there, but fresh planks ran beneath them. It no longer looked like an open wound. It looked like a scar that had finally started to heal. "Maybe it is time," Ellen murmured, "for this place to be remembered not only for the fire, but for the night we sat here and stopped lying." Thomas laid a hand on her shoulder. Jonah helped Clara down the steps. Together they walked out into the white winter morning, still carrying the scar, but carrying it lighter. Down in the valley, Willow Ford was the same small town of wind and dust. The news would spread. The gossip would twist the story into new shapes. But this time, under all the talk, there would be 4 people who no longer had to run from a cabin on the mountain. For hearts worn out from so much silence, that alone was its own kind of happiness. If tonight's story stirred something in your own memories, if you have ever lived through a long winter just because no one would tell the truth, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, so we can sit together like this each evening and listen to more tales of love and life from the Old West. And if you feel like it, remember to hit like, leave a comment, and turn on the little bell so you do not miss any of the journeys to come from Tales from the Wild West. Who knows? The next story might be the very one your heart has been waiting on for a long, long time.